Aristotle once observed that man is by nature a political animal. Do you think this is always the case? Would you be corrupted by power? What of organized systems of government? Ancient Greece introduced the concept of checks and balances to ensure that the power of the individual would not be without limit. The Roman Empire developed and standardized this system further. Yet their emperors were known for squandering money on lavish personal affairs while neglecting the needs of the masses. Of the 37 emperors that ruled the empire in its last 100 years, 25 were assassinated. In modern times, too, we find ourselves fraught with political scandals. Is there a solution to this rampant problem of political corruption? What type of government has the most potential for fair and just leadership? Which qualities should we look for in a leader? Must absolute power corrupt? Let us join a discussion between Dr. Michael Kigel and Rabbi Mendel Kaplan, who will examine Jewish history and philosophy, address many of these complicated questions, and introduce the Torah's picture of the ultimate government of the future.
The story is told that the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, in the years of upheaval, prior to the Communist Revolution, was sitting on a train in a smoking car. And he heard a group of Jewish people having a discussion. The discussion revolved around systems of government and which would the Torah prefer. This was the talk of the day. Communism, socialism, democracy, monarchy. And each one of these people that were highly educated, each one advanced a proof from the Torah that the system of government that he favored was the Torah's system of government, or the system of government that the Torah favored, the Torah intended for humanity to live by.
You can see it actually.
You can find
socialist democracy,
ideas in Torah.
Socialism.
One could find democratic ideas in Torah.
Right.
One could find monarchist ideas in Torah.
Except perhaps for fascism, outright fascism, where the first and last voice.
Find fascism in the Torah too. Good fascism, that is.
Good fascism, which is not fascism then. Fascism, in other words, fascism where the dictator dictates everything from the ground up, including the law. That I don't think you can find.
Let's not get sidetracked on fascism. So the Friedrich Rebbe was a young man at the time. He said, can I mix into your conversation? And they turned around, not knowing who he was. And he said to them, you're all right, and you're all wrong. He explained. You're all right because every one of you has brought a proof from the Torah. And the truth is that there are certain details in the Torah that very much look like what we would call socialism. There are details in the Torah that look very much like what we call democracy, etc. He says you're all wrong because the Torah is neither system. The Torah comes from God. And God is the perfection of everything. And the Torah is the embodiment of perfection. So in a perfected, true system, everything in the world can be found within a perfected system.
But tell
there
me,
is no
Torah,
system.
But the Torah explicitly mentions kingship, monarchy.
The Torah explicitly talks about ideas of socialism, sharing for all peoples. The Torah doesn't make a distinction between a royal and between a commoner who committed a crime, per se.
Oh, in that sense, it's true. At the level of law.
In a monarchy, if the king's son commits murder, he doesn't go to trial, he doesn't go to jail. It's not a true monarchy.
In good old-fashioned monarchy.
In good old-fashioned monarchy, the king's son can do as he pleases.
Well, that's really fascism. That's what I mean by fascism. Fascism. That's tyranny.
Now we're going to get into semantics, and Putin is a tyrant of sorts, but a lot of people in Russia love him. They feel he's brought Russia back to some form of glory. A lot of the kings were very much beloved.
Let me ask you this. Is there a difference between law and government?
That's an abstract question. Can you be more specific?
Is there a difference between, let me make it more specific. For example, in our country, there's a clear difference between, or in the States, between legislation and the relationship between the Senate and the legislature and the government, the actual president, who endorses the laws of the legislature. So the president is not there to formulate laws. He's the ultimate policeman in a sense. He's the highest policeman, the most powerful policeman in the country.
You're talking about the United States?
The United States.
He's called the commander-in-chief, but I never heard him referred to him as chief of police.
Well, I mean, it's not by a coincidence that the word police and politics have the same root. Right? Politics comes from polis,
Yes.
which means the city-state.
Yes, so I would like to focus on exactly this point.
Okay.
You're talking about the idea that politics and police are connected.
Yeah.
Why do we need government? Why do we need monarchy? Why do we need a king? What is the purpose of having a ruler? What is the reason for it? Why does the Torah indicate that it's necessary and needed? The answer, on a very, very base level, is that government is needed to keep law and order, either for actual enforcement or the fear of the law. As the Mishnah tells us, that a person should pray for the welfare of government, if not for the fear that government instills. And that was said by Rabbi Hanina ben Trajan, who was executed by the government of his day, the Roman government. And yet he said, one has to pray for government because we need to have a system of government. Anarchy does not benefit anybody.
Job of government is to basically uphold the law. Let's say. So, is there a better system of upholding the law? Is democracy no better than monarchy?
We live in an imperfect world. And in an imperfect world, you have to deal with imperfect solutions or imperfect realities.
Right.
In the current situation that we live in today, a socialist democracy like our country of Canada is probably the best possible government one could have.
Right. Given the state of mind of people in general.
And given the reality that people don't accept any absolutes, including the moral ethos dictated by God.
Right.
So at least you have something that keeps power in check. Checks and balances are needed for imperfect realities. Yeah. But Moshiach is perfect. And the Messianic world is perfect. So we won't need to have conflicting sides to create balance.
Actually, this is a stumbling block in even thinking Mashiach, right? We can't even, I think the average person has an allergy to the concept of Mashiach for this reason, above all. Like, is a king? What do you mean a king?
Absolute power freaks us out.
Yeah.
You know why
for good reason. Historically, we've had really bad experiences with absolute power.
Who are bad, when given possibilities of unlimited power, can do very scary things.
Yeah.
Power corrupts.
Yeah.
Even a good person who becomes very powerful can get corrupted. So we need checks and balances. But if Mashiach is a perfect individual, perfect tzaddik, and the world's going to be perfect, there's no need for checks and balances. That doesn't make any sense. So the notion of people saying, well, Mashiach has to have somebody who's keeping him in check is saying that there is no Mashiach. If you believe there is a Mashiach, you don't need to keep the Mashiach in check.
But you see, then it's, at least intellectually, it's a formidable task to rehabilitate the concept of a king Mashiach, after millennia of bad royalty.
I'll give you a better one. After 2 millennia of bad messianism, it's going to be a formidable task for us to rehabilitate messianism.
For sure.
So, we'll leave that to Mashiach. Many Jews get very uncomfortable hearing the word Mashiach altogether. So, no, please, that sounds like another religion.
We're not talking at the level of what God's going to do. Obviously, that He's going to decide to do it His way and in His good time and exactly the way He wants it done. But insofar as we are contributing somehow to the coming of Mashiach, insofar as if we do contribute,
we certainly contribute.
So we have to have a little bit of clarity in our thinking about the telos, the end, the goal.
That's why we're talking about this.
That's right.
We're talking about a perfected individual.
So in order to have that clarity about the goal, we have to overcome this natural allergic reaction to the concept of a monarch.
The natural allergic reaction is based on the reality of today. And the reality of today is not the reality of tomorrow. You know what it's like saying?
But we have to be able
it's like
to
saying
see.
if
We have
there's
to
a
be able to
world,
see a little bit of the
world with
future.
no germs,
Yeah.
you won't have to wash your hands. The doctor won't have to wash his hands anymore. Why not? Because there are no germs. We can't imagine such a thing today. So a doctor who doesn't have not washing his hands, to us is unsanitary. What if there would be no longer any germs? What if germs cease to exist? We can't imagine that.
But the problem with that parallel is that we've never had a world without germs. We've never known anything
We've
like
never
that.
known a world with Mashiach either.
But we use.
But we had to have
right.
good monarchs.
So that's
David
my point.
HaMelech.
Exactly. That's my point. Is that when we talk about Moshiach, we actually latch on to a concept that's been around for a long time. That's been perverted. It's been stomped on. It's been ruined. But the concept is there. So the question, if you're going to use the germs example, then I would say, well, let's go all the way and just forget the concept of king altogether. Let's talk about an age which is totally unprecedented. So leave it at that.
There are
talk
two
about
people.
a king.
There are two people whose memories are invoked when we talk about Mashiach. When we talk about Redeemer, when we talk about Teacher, we invoke the image of a memory of Moshe Rabbeinu.
Right.
As it's famous saying of our sages, Moshe, Hu Goel Rishon, Hu Goel Rachan. Moses is the first Redeemer, Moses is the last Redeemer. So it's the Mosaic soul
Right.
that will be reincarnated and serve as Mashiach. And the other figure is David HaMelech, King David. As I say, David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayim, King David lives for all eternity. The nature of, and the spirit of King David, in a way, lives on forever. And Mashiach is actually called David Acher, another David.
Right.
So David HaMelech
and is
was
literally
that
a
perfect
descendant
person.
of him. Has
Yeah,
to
of course,
be. That's
has
one
to
of the
be
criteria.
a descendant of David and Shlomo.
Right.
Correct. So that's the point.
So that we do have an example of absolute power does not corrupt absolutely.
Exactly.
Okay,
but
good.
of course, we don't really know what Moshe Rabbeinu was like. We don't really know what David HaMelech was like. So
We know to
it's
some
not
we know a
that
little
tangible.
bit. I mean, we have a book on it. You're right.
A
We don't
book on the life. You
the-
have a
the
book
of Samuel
biblical
is, yeah.
revelation
Right.
where the Torah tells us details that are relevant for us to learn from. We
Right.
don't have a book that describes the persona of Moses or tells us if he wore shoes or sandals.
But
Or what he ate for
but
breakfast.
insofar as David HaMelech gives us an adumbration, a shadow cast on the wall of what we're looking at, what we might be looking at, right? And we want to have that image in front of our eyes as we're working towards Mashiach. Why do we look to David HaMelech and say, that's government? You want government? The best government we ever had. May not be perfect, okay? Mashiach's government is going to be way better, to be sure. But if we want to look at a system of government that is what we really want as Torah observant Jews, wouldn't we have to commit ourselves to that? And
David HaMelech's government, yes.
Yeah, and say,
Yes.
you know what? That's better than any democracy that has ever been
Shlomo
around.
HaMelech's government in the end failed. Shaul failed as an individual. King Saul,
Okay, they're
King
all
Solomon.
kings. But how about democracy?
The only king who didn't fail, so to speak,
Yeah,
was David.
right.
King David didn't fail, and in King David's era, it says everybody was at peace. And everybody had
Chizkiyahu,
everything
who
they
also had
needed.
a pretty good track record.
Chizkiyahu, by the way, is almost in the running for Mashiach. In fact, the Gemara says, "Bikesh Hakadosh Baruch Hu las Chizkiyahu Mashiach." God almost made Chizkiyahu Hezekiah Mashiach.
So what was better about their system of government over
It was
ours?
the Torah system of government.
Over ours.
It was the Torah system of government, and
so
they were
in
individuals
what way was it
who
better?
didn't need those checks and balances because they were totally righteous.
Because they were righteous.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mashiach's personal righteousness and absolute utter dedication to everything holy and to God is the primary criteria. Otherwise, he can't be a Mashiach. Mashiach's not a good politician. Mashiach's not somebody with a good smile. Mashiach's not an individual who can win an election. Mashiach's an individual who, by sheer force of his spiritual persona, commands everybody's respect and everybody's loyalty. And David HaMelech did that, and Chizkiyahu did it.
What would be the difference between having a king or an oligarchy of righteous men and women? There's no difference. It's a righteous government. We're talking about a righteous
That's
government.
true.
It doesn't matter what the numbers are. It's
know,
basically
you
the
know,
bottom
it's
line,
interesting.
right? So might as well be one.
When
It's easier to
Moshe
count,
Rabbeinu
right?
I shouldn't say chooses, but when God is choosing a successor, Moshe Rabbeinu would like to have kind of a position for his son. That's what it says.
Right.
So Moshe said, let Joshua be the spiritual leader because he knew his son couldn't be a spiritual leader. He said, let him be the prime minister. You know what Rashi tells us about that? Putting from the Medrash? God says, Daber echad ladar v'lo shnei dabronim. There's one spokesperson for the company. There's only going to be one person calling the shots. That's the problem in most synagogues. The president and rabbi are always fighting. Who's in charge?
Yeah,
Who's in the driver's seat?
But we're assuming a world in which there is no conflict. I mean, you yourself said that, for example, the Sanhedrin.
The reason that the people have those checks and balances in place is because they're afraid of absolute power and they're afraid of things going wrong.
In this world, but in the world of Mashiach, that won't be the case.
Exactly.
There won't be any checks and balances that
It's
are necessary.
not even in the world of Mashiach. In the personage of Mashiach, it won't be necessary, even if the rest of the world it would be, which, by the way, it won't be. But the personage of Mashiach doesn't require those checks and balances, as we see with David HaMelech, as we see with Chizkiyahu, as we see with Moshe Rabbeinu, as we see with Yehoshua.
It's true, because even David HaMelech needed, for example, Nathan the prophet, Shmuel.
So that's why Mashiach will be at a level with Messianic era is going to be different. But in principle, David HaMelech was totally righteous. We see David HaMelech as a totally righteous and a holy individual.
So Mashiach will be the person that, wow, that's really wild. Somebody beyond checks and balances. That's amazing. I can't even imagine such a thing. A human being, and therefore an age beyond checks and balances.
You know, see, as a chassid, I have no problem imagining it, because that's how I saw the Rebbe.
As a person beyond checks and balances.
I saw the Rebbe as a person who was so totally self-effacing, so transparent, that there was no issue, chas v'shalom, for checks and balances. Checks and balances were only relevant outside of the Rebbe's existence. To us, the Rebbe was perfect.
I consider myself a chassid as well, by the way. But obviously I'm not as old a chassid as you are. I'm older than you, but I'm not as old a chassid as you.
Also never had the good fortune of seeing the Rebbe.
I didn't for sure. So I speak from humility and from ignorance, obviously. But for example, the fact that the Rebbe explicitly asked Reb Moshe Feinstein certain halachic questions suggests not, God forbid, that his character was in question. I don't for a moment, as a chassid, believe that the Rebbe's character needed any checks and balances. But at least intellectually, at least at some level, at the level of psak, he needed to ask Reb Moshe Shaila.
The Rebbe didn't ask. The Rebbe wanted others to paskin.
But he could have given the psak himself.
There's no doubt in my mind that the Rebbe could have given the psak himself.
Because it seems to me like it seems to me like a bit of a dance to suggest that he would only ask him almost as a formality.
The Rebbe, it's not a formality. The Rebbe did not want, for one reason or another, and here we can speculate and make all kinds of theories, but it's clear the Rebbe did not want to be involved, as a rule, in giving halachic rulings.
But why can't we suppose that, maybe we're going off topic here, but for example, just as the Rebbe did not think it was important for him to develop his artistic skills like Nachshon, the painter, or like Shmulik, the cobbler, so why can't we say that was not his métier?
Because
not that he couldn't have developed himself
there's no question in my mind that every area of Torah that Rebbe developed fully.
Developed to the nth degree.
We're getting into very strange waters.
Are we?
Yeah.
I'm asking this even again. When we talk about Mashiach, we don't say that the Sanhedrin or the Nasi of the Sanhedrin is irrelevant. We can say forget the Sanhedrin. Mashiach is the first and last voice.
Checks and balances. The ideas of checks and balances are related to the idea of ego and the idea of somebody doing the wrong thing. Okay?
Well,
whether the Rebbe wanted somebody else's opinion or relied on somebody else's opinion, the whole idea of making a mistake, of having a skewed perspective.
Yeah.
Skewed perspectives come when there are other things involved.
But not just egos. There is such a thing as a mistake.
There's a holy ego too.
No. But there is such a thing as error. Pure error has nothing to do with ego. Just I made a mistake. It's not it's just the nature of
finitude. It will sound very strange to our
It's
viewers. Maybe sound strange to you. But as a chassid, I could not see the Rebbe making mistakes, and I don't believe that Moshe Rabbeinu's chassidim saw him as making mistakes, and I don't believe Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's chassidim saw him as making mistakes, or Rabbi Akiva's disciples saw him as making mistakes. You know, the Mishnah says that you have to look at your Rebbe as Kemalach Hashem's voice, like an angel. The angels make mistakes.
Did Moshe Rabbeinu make mistakes? Did David HaMelech make mistakes?
Not on our level.
That's for sure. In Chas v'Shalom, I would never.
So checks
I would
and
never think that someone like the Rebbe or someone like the Rebbe would make it.
Checks and balances are only required when there is an imperfection or a deficiency. That's the check and balance. That's the balance, the
human
imperfection.
existence is imperfect, just by intrinsically imperfect, just because we're finite. I mean, it's not that kind of imperfection. It's not from any lack in the ego.
What are you getting at?
I mean, I would also go along with the idea that the Rebbe never made a mistake because he wasn't put in the position of being a Moshiach.
Let me tell you something. The truth is that our conversation is moot and irrelevant because my personal view of it, the only reason I'm offering this to you is just to tell you that to me it doesn't sound so far-fetched.
Right. It doesn't sound that far-fetched to me either. It doesn't sound that far-fetched to me either.
The real point that has to be made is that Moshiach will be a person who doesn't need those checks and balances. The whole idea of doubt, of suffering, comes from the fact that things are not perfect today. That's why there can be something called doubt. When Mashiach comes, there will be an era of clarity where there can be no doubt, where Mashiach will have no ego or personal axe to grind.
That's for sure.
And that's why Mashiach doesn't have to govern with a Senate or a Parliament or a Congress. And the fear of power corrupting and absolute power corrupting absolutely is simply irrelevant when it comes to Mashiach.
I certainly see it. Again, I agree with you almost to the very end, 99%. I mean, I don't think there's any question of ego here, and I don't think that. I mean, a messianic era is not an era where egos are in conflict. That makes sense. That's
clear. I went beyond that, though. I told the idea of suffix, the idea of doubts.
You're talking about really a prophetic level. I guess that's really the difference, right? A prophet,
Mashiach, it says, will be almost as great a prophet as Moses.
That's right. I mean, a Rav, a rabbi, can make mistakes.
No question.
There's no question. And even the greatest rabbi can make a mistake.
No question about that.
And a king can make a mistake, and at least historically, every king that we've ever known, including David HaMelech, made a mistake. The mistake is not like the mistake that I would make.
There's a story told.
But a prophet, because the prophet is not really himself. It's really God.
Well, the thing is, only when he's in prophecy mode.
When he's in prophecy mode.
There's a story told about the Rabbi Yehuda. The Rebbe repeated this story a number of times. Who was once asked a question, and the Rabbi Yehuda became the Rav in one of the largest cities of Europe when he was 17 years old. So every rabbi has enemies. Even the Rabbi Yehuda had enemies. The story goes that the enemies in those days were a little different than today. They didn't fight him with politics, but they fought him with trying to prove he didn't know everything. He's not the greatest scholar. Whilst others maintained that he was. So they came and they asked him a question, and he made a mistake. He gave a ruling which wasn't in perfect consonance with the Shulchan Aruch, and they arrived with a big Shulchan Aruch and opened it up, and they showed him, Rabbi made a mistake. So what was his response? It wasn't really a question. It was a bogus question anyway. So the rabbi's friends investigated, and they found that it was true. They came to him and they said, Ebba, how did you know? So he said to them, the notion that a person can tell you the halacha is such and such is in some ways preposterous. How can a person be so sure of himself? A halacha means the will of God. How could any human being ever be sure that he has the will of God? Well, the answer is in the Gemara about David HaMelech that Hashem imo, God is with him. And that's why halacha kamoto, that's why the halacha can be like him. So in order to have the ability to lay down a ruling, you have to have divine inspiration. So he said, divine inspiration is only relevant when it's a question of what somebody should do. I knew if Hashem didn't help me here, that it wouldn't be relevant. So it wasn't relevant.
Right, so he didn't get divine inspiration. So maybe that's
Maybe that will help.
Let me ask you this.
Maybe that will help some of our viewers understand this or
it will,
crystallize.
because you know what it does? Because it really, I think maybe one of the difficulties is understanding how different archetypes can collapse and become one. So we can understand what a king is. We can understand what government is. We can understand what a rabbi is, a teacher, a prophet. But what's very difficult to understand is how a king is a prophet.
And is a rabbi.
And is a rabbi. And is one and the same.
And is a spiritual leader.
And not only that, but that those faculties, not that he is like a Renaissance man, because that's one way to bring it together. He's a Renaissance, he's a painter on Mondays, he's a skier on Tuesdays, right? But to say that his very royalty is actually prophetic. As you're saying about the Rabbi Yehuda, that his being a rabbi actually participates in prophecy.
Prophecy is a hard word to use, but there is divine inspiration for a rabbi who is conscientious and studies as much as he can and did everything right. which I don't know if any rabbis can say that today, but there's something called siyata d'shmaya. There's help from heaven. The truth is there's help from heaven in everything you do. Who says your television shows will go well? It has to be siyata d'shmaya.
If you like that video, hit the subscribe button and notification bell below for hours of the best Jewish content online.